we had several different goals in the project, and one of them was really just to get people from across the food space into the same virtual space, in this case, to just really have some conversations that aren't easy to have when everyone is living their busy lives and in different provinces, and I think that was really important, and some really important connections and relationships were built. People actually really did engage very deeply in some really difficult conversations, some very scary conversations, and I think there was, more toward the end, people were able to do some imagining about what things might look like, how scary that might be. It was hard to stay there for people, but they were able, there was enough support to actually help people sort of really take a step back from the day-to-day, and through a creative process engage with something that's unknown and something that's pretty overwhelming. We didn't really nail those stories in terms of kind of really having that clear sort of scenario process laid out. And I know you have lots of thoughts about this too. I think on the one hand, we probably could have supported people to get there, but we didn't give it enough time, because I think what we didn't factor in enough, we did a fair amount of this, but we didn't do enough of the supporting people to actually be with the really difficult feelings of having to look at the future and what could potentially happen.
In a weekend setting, in a retreat space or some other space, going into those harder truths about the climate crisis, and holding that, and then creating something creative from that, would have been easier, whereas in this kind of session setup, we had 3-hour or 2-hour chunks, and they were on Zoom, and then they were weeks apart, which doesn't really lend itself to that creative energy, and also it's harder to hold that space as a group.
Because we had this sort of sense of we need to create a thing and it needs to happen by a certain time, we weren't able to really hold that as much as I think would have been ideal, because the reality is people's lives are very complicated, and it's not always possible for people to take action in the ways that the direness of the situation makes it feel like we need to.
Yeah. Setting some roots or planting some seeds of ideas, beliefs and values, or perceptions of what the future might be, is, given that this is a leadership group, was almost more important than an outcome of a story creative product that communities could use, especially with this group of leaders.
Just shifting the purpose to be a tiny bit less outcome focused and more process focused. So recognizing that we might not have beautiful, perfect scenarios that come out of it, and it's more about really encouraging a deepening of the conversation because of the potential roots that could plant and the potential longer term impact that could have.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to move towards a future that you can't quite imagine yet. I think the group started to go there, and that's a critical piece of moving to a new paradigm shift. All the narrative research that I look at shows essentially that we get stuck in our current system patterns and beliefs and colonial ideas when even discussing something in a group that already believes in, say, a topic like basic income, or understands that the climate crisis is here. It's very difficult to imagine what the new system future will be because we haven't seen it yet. So we have to ground ourselves in stories that we want more of, that are in our current system or in our current life, and see if we can take them to that next level. And I think we started to go there with the project.
There's this real sense of urgency, I think, for those of us that really want to see change happen and want to see us survive and thrive and feel like we have a future. and are really wanting to push hard on that urgency makes a lot of sense. And of course there's this feeling of urgency, and there is actual real urgency, but it doesn't always serve. It's not always actually going to lead to the result that we want it to lead to. In fact, I think it often doesn't, because it's not respecting that this is like an entire massive paradigm shift.
One session, someone will show up and be terrified about the climate crisis and fires and so on. In the next session, they'll be okay about that, but like really wanting to move and do things and take action. And then another session, they'll be completely tired and just totally zonked and burned. And so the range and extremity of that seems to be increasing in terms of energy that's showing up in any space I facilitate.
I wonder if the more we sort of tell people how urgent it is, the harder it feels to actually engage in it, because of that sort of general sense of everything just kind of being too much. It's like right now it feels like everything is just reacting to the next crisis, and eventually the crises, I think we're feeling this a little bit, that the crises add up to the point where you actually just can't be reacting to them. If we don't figure out how to have these conversations and actually really hold the difficulty of it, process the grief and the loss of everything that's changing, that is devastating, and that is like actually really traumatizing to think about. We have to actually process those feelings and the resistance to having those feelings, and get through that to be able to have the kind of conversations that let us make some plans, right? And project what might possibly happen, so that we can actually respond from a place of not just being in reaction crisis mode all the time, but really actually saying, okay, if this happens, then we have these options. And we've been preparing for that. Like, we've been building the necessary infrastructure to be able to have sustainable food here. And we've been, thinking about actually doing regenerative farming and like all of these kinds of things. And we have plans in that direction. But if we're not having those conversations because it's too hard to sort of really get to that point of knowing that we need to have those conversations, then everything is just going to keep happening as this wave of crisis that we have to react to, and that just feels so much worse to me.
Well, how do we, as human beings, make ourselves believe that what feels impossible is actually possible? And so I think that in my experience with food and climate change comes from doing things in community. So if we're gonna talk about growing food gardens and food forests, then we need to go into food forests and be planting some things as part of these processes, so that we can actually embody what we sometimes feel is impossible in some of these conversations. I think the next steps are to gather people together and see what's next together. I think there's more story refining that could happen if that's something that people want to explore, and then promote those stories and use them as a community tool.
Let things be emergent. Like, don't feel completely tied to a schedule or a plan, but really letting it, like, being able to adjust to what needs to happen.
Perhaps, given that this was a food thing, tasting, sensing activities as well that were somehow shared with the group, even if it was on Zoom.
And some days I feel hopeful about it, and some days I think it'll probably be a little rough. I think it'll be rough, but the degree of rough depends on the day and the hopefulness.
Yeah, I believe that what seems impossible is possible, but yeah, it's not going to be easy.